Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this last event of the evening today. I'm acutely aware that we are all that stands between you and dinner. So we will do our utmost to provide an intellectual treat in anticipation of the gastronomic treats that will await you on the outside. I have not orchestrated this conversation in any detail. So I'm going to rely on the creativity of my fellow panelists to engage with me and engage with each other. I don't think I have to say much about the importance of this topic because the challenges of fragmentation pertain to nothing less than the future of the international system itself. I do want to just say a few words, though, to bound the subject that we are going to be talking about. And let me start by saying that until very recently, the international system was characterized by quite successful globalization, deepening economic links across borders, a modicum of stability in great power relations, and the primacy of markets in the development and the dissemination of technology across national boundaries. As a result of multiple developments over the last 2 decades, each of these three realities is now under significant attack. And what we want to do in this panel this evening is to consider the various dimensions of the challenges and to try and illuminate what their consequences are. So I'm going to curate a conversation with my fellow panelists to start, and then I'm going to open the floor to the audience, and I will take questions or comments at an appropriate time. So let me start by addressing a generic question to two individuals in the panels. My friend Raja Mohan, who has given a lot of thought about fissures in the international system and is well known to this audience. And then I want to go to James Crabtree, who is located in a very interesting part of the world, Southeast Asia, which is struggling to make sense of the emerging fissures in the international system. And so I want to ask the two of you, are the fears of fragmentation real? How will we manage the issues of fragmentation in the face of the competing driver of economic integration, which is still quite powerful and still driven by market forces? So Raja, if you could take a crack at answering this, that would be great.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Carnegie, for inviting me. Actually, three broad trends when we talk about fissures. One is economic, which you mentioned, and the sources of this fissure actually comes from the domestic politics of the developed countries, United States in particular. The idea that globalization would benefit all American people, that belief has been challenged politically. Economists can say something else, but in the politically people do vote. So the political consensus in the US in favor of economic globalization, in favor of markets, so the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, that has broken down. And the need for rearranging the domestic economic order, so that's been a primary source. And the flip side of the economic thing is the global economic order. The US, the great preacher of globalization, today tells, look, it doesn't work for me. And if a system doesn't work for the number one power, the rules have to change. So the US is actually telling you the rules need to be changed because it doesn't work for American domestic politics. Therefore, you need to rearrange the global economic order. The third area of fissure, I would say, is the post-1991 belief, almost religious, that multilateralism will have answers to all the world's problems. That faith has been shattered. And the notion that multilateral institutions, whether the UN Security Council, the WTO, or other forums, or in Asia, the ASEAN, will have answers to all our problems. That has also been shattered because it's been proven that they're not in a position to deal with the challenges that have emerged. And linked to this, of course, is the breakdown of the great power harmony that came in post-1991, the end of the Cold War. So what is interesting is, to our discussion here, technology is at the cutting edge of the rearrangement. That is, domestic economy. If the US needs to rework its economy to be able to compete with China and others, you need to have a green transition. You need to invest in production of new, using new technologies, bring back manufacturing of semiconductors to the US, and to leverage various possibilities to restart put US back on a path that used to be as a number one technological power, and end the outsourcing to China. Well, we talk about the technological revolution. We all say China has done very well, yes, but it's American venture capital that's facilitated China's rise. Now US is saying there's a problem, we're not going to do it. So on the economic side, the technology is the principal instrument for rearranging the domestic economic order as well as the global economic order. Second, I think on the great power rivalry, as China began to assert itself, this idea China would be giant Switzerland, would only be interested in making money and not interested in anything else. I think that myth has been shattered. China wants to be a great power. It has unredeemed territorial claims against many of its neighbors. So as China asserts itself, the question of US role in Asia has come to the fore. And what the US is saying today is, you can't balance against China, you can't deter China by doing more weapons, more numbers to deal with the Chinese problem. So therefore, technology is critical for restoring deterrence of some kind against China. So therefore, technology comes back in restoring a measure of great power balance in this. And finally, on the multilateralism side, this notion that UN will negotiate multilateral technological treaties, that has collapsed. So therefore, what we're seeing is the creation of like-minded coalitions, which the US is now developing on a range of areas, on economic side, resilient supply chains, on great power coalitions beyond the world alliances, and new technological coalitions. So this is the new phrase. And I think for India, it's a good moment that when we talk about fragmentation, we also talk about integration. We talk about rearrangement. We're not seeing simply breakdown of the old order. What we're seeing is today, the US, for its interests, needs to rearrange, needs new partners. And I think India is very much at the front and center of rearranging the US economy, US technology, and the US institutions. So for the first time today, in India, that is in a position to contribute both to the evolution of new technologies as well as the management of them, puts India in a very interesting position. And the fact that India and the US have a good relationship today shows there's room for good news. This is not all, we don't have to be depressed that the world is breaking apart. There are new partnerships, new coalitions, and some of them, I think, will have serious effects on the way the system is organized.
Thank you. That was a great start. James, let me ask you a specific question that came out of the very first point that Raja raised, which is the attacks on globalization are deriving from the domestic politics in the developed world. Now, you live in Southeast Asia, where globalization has had terrific benefits in terms of elevating the fortunes, the economic fortunes of a very critical part of the world. What is your reading of the attitudes to the current crisis of fragmentation and globalization from within the Southeast Asian states?
So I think there's a sort of general pessimism tempered with a small amount of optimism, which is that what you see happening at the moment, the beginnings of a more fragmented economic system, has some benefits for trade-dependent Southeast Asian countries. So as some measure of economic activity shifts out of China as countries in the West in particular try and de-risk their economies, some of that ends up in Thailand or Malaysia or the Philippines, just as it will in Mexico or Poland. The risk, I think, for the Western countries is that you create a model of globalization which is more complicated, but you don't actually fundamentally get much in the way of insurance de-risking, as in you're diverting some economic, Chinese companies are moving to Mexico to sell into the US, or American companies are shifting some of their production to Vietnam or wherever it might be, some to India. Fundamentally, they're still reliant on Chinese components. And so I think both on the technological dimension, but also the sort of economic manufacturing dimension, there's an underlying logic which pushes you to more fragmentation over time. On the technological domain, the yard gets bigger and the fence gets higher. It starts in semiconductors, but then it goes on to some of the other areas that Seth Center mentioned in the previous session. It seems to me inconceivable that the national security concerns that the United States and its partners have in semiconductors will not also apply to advanced synthetic biotech or quantum. It's just we haven't quite got there yet, and they haven't worked out the mechanisms in which the controls will need to be put in place. Equally, when you realize that you're, in a sense, creating a model of globalization that is more complicated, but that hasn't actually moved, hasn't done much to de-risk, you'll end up doing more. So I think on those dimensions, so Raja mentioned three, so there you have technology and economics. The dynamic is in favor of more fragmentation. The same is true on international governance. I think it was to India's credit that you managed to have a reasonably successful G20, but trying to get a body like the G20 to work in this environment is extraordinarily difficult, because the broader the grouping and the more you have the United States and Europe on the one hand and China and Russia on the other, the more difficult it is to get it to work. So I think you have dynamics across all of those areas, technology, economic globalization, and global governance, that are pushing towards fragmentation. And what you have on the other side of the ledger, which is of interest to countries in an area like Southeast Asia, is exactly what Raja said. The energy then comes in smaller groupings, minilateral groupings of those who are more like-minded, particularly with respect to those who are more worried about the rise of China. And then you have, non-aligned states who don't want to be closely aligned to either side, who are trying to come up with new creative configurations. So a lot of the energy in the international system is on those different dimensions. And India sort of finds itself quite enticingly placed almost between those groups, the like-minded who are very closely tied to the US and very worried about China, and then the non-aligned who want to have an approach which is more multi-aligned, as we saw with the BRICS enlargement. So,
let me bring Joanna into this conversation. I'd like you to address one of the fears, I think, that James flagged, which is the competitive dynamic that Seth Center also described in the earlier conversation between the US and China could take us to a point where it's no longer a small yard and high fence, but a large yard and an ever higher fence. Will we have the political wisdom as well as the technological smarts to be able to figure out what the Goldilocks solution is to avoid us getting to that outcome, which I presume would not exactly be, one, what was intended, and two, could have serious economic and possibly political consequences? How do you see the pressures with respect to being able to keep these critical technologies in a really small basket?
Well, I think to start with, it's acknowledgement that we won't be able to, and it probably isn't in our interests to do so. So I think to be able to strategically harness these technologies, we need to be able to strategically harness the fragmentation. That requires us to admit that we're already fragmented at the very high end of technology. We're not at the lower end of technology. And we should keep it that way, right? We should be, when we're talking about fragmentation of technology, we need to be specific about what type of fragmentation. And, James is talking about the high-end AI chips, for example. And then I think it's the country that is most effective at harnessing that fragmentation that will prevail and shape the future of geopolitics. What do I mean by that in a very specific sense? In the last year, we've seen an absolute awakening of the power of artificial intelligence, but diametrically opposite awakenings in the global south and the global north. So in the global north, there's been an awakening of the immense risk, the threat that is posed by the development of these technologies, and the conversation is all focused on risk and threat. In the global south, the conversation is focused on the opportunity for these technologies to deliver economic development outcomes and empower populations. China gets that. And when China is talking to countries in the global south, China is talking about the opportunity to empower. And if we, and I'm using Australia here in the context of being situated within the global south, but often associated as being global north, if we don't appreciate the opportunity that these technologies present and engage with the global south, recognizing that, China will reshape the technology because China will deliver that technology to the global south, to the population. And if you deliver that technology, you will shape the future, not just of geopolitics, but the future of interactions between people at the citizen-to-citizen level as well. So I think we need to be recognizing, and how do you do that? What's the magic to unlock that? It's to recognize that we need to partner with countries like India and make sure that we're moving at the speed of innovation and ensuring that our governance is moving at the speed of innovation. China does not take its governance at the speed of innovation. If we can have innovation and governance, protections built into the technologies, that is how we unlock the competitive advantage, and that is how we shape the future.
So it seems to me we have two challenges simultaneously. One is in the global south, we have to be better providers, or for want of a better word, sort of public goods, which the south has significant deficits in and is looking for help. And the Chinese have great incentives at positioning themselves as privileged providers. But we have a second problem, which is within our own alliances, because as we think in terms of fragmentation, and our responses to fragmentation can come at the costs of alliance cohesion. And I remember in the aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act, the number of our European allies who were uncomfortable with what they saw as some unilateralist solutions that the United States was adopting. So I want to bring Dan here because he's spent a lifetime thinking about our European partners and our alliances. Can we pull this off effectively, Dan? So providing sufficient opportunities and technologies and access and assistance to the South, while at the same time creating an equitable division within our own alliance relationships. How do you see the future on this question? Because it seems to me, and I'm going to come to the US-China thing very quickly, and I want the ambassador's view and Vijay's, but it seems to me that if we don't get that right, then we're going to be doubly handicapped. So I want you to respond to both those challenges.
I'm trying to stick to the geopolitics frame of the session. I mean, on the IRA specifically, which is too tempting not to dig in on, I think on that specific example, when the history books are written, it will turn out that the IRA ended up catalyzing a bunch of innovation in Europe, including, and also a bunch of public spending that needed to happen in Europe, and that the US was perfectly right to say, we should have given you a better explanation ahead of time, and we should have made sure that there weren't unintended consequences that could have been averted. But we did this, and by the way, you've been telling us to spend more money on green transition for the last 10 years, so decide what you want because you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. And by the way, you then went and created your own green investment fund, and actually we all need to be investing more into the green transition. So I think the IRA specifically, and the friction that it existed, or arguably still exists to a lesser degree, right after it, that's less of a challenge. I think what we do see is that we are still in this, it's too soon to tell whether we'll pull it off. We're in this moment of transition. You saw Jake Sullivan give the speech at Brookings earlier this year, following close on the heels of a similar speech by Janet Yellen. And you see these, going back to your opening frame, you see these senior American officials trying to square the circle of the country that has led a free market revolution that was truly global, now taking a bunch of policy decisions many of which you disagree with, but I agree with, that seem to run in the face of orthodoxy. And it should not be surprising, given the general context, that there are old orthodoxies that are being challenged and that are under strain. And we have seen we talk about technology and geopolitics as if they're separate things, but really the last conversation and every conversation so far has made clear, technology is a form of power. And when technology advances, governance has to respond or fail to respond. And I think one of the real questions of the moment we're in, not only because of technology, but because of the economic changes of recent decades that have been accelerated by technology, is whether or not the world will have to learn how important a genuine order rather than great power competition is in the old-fashioned way, which of course is through great power conflict. And the thing that we should all be focused on is whether we can figure out a different way for the world to coalesce around whatever form of order comes after this inflection point, which may be a decade long.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very useful reminder that, technology is not epiphenomenal, right? It's baked into the character of the competition itself, which sort of brings me to the China question. And what I find interesting about the China problem is that even as we want to maintain our dominance of key technologies, which is completely understandable, even as we want to make certain that it's not just simply us, but a set of partners that will profit from this dominance, we also have links with China, which are extremely important for the well-being of our societies. And therefore, the option of any comprehensive decoupling really is beyond reach. And Australia has gone through that, really, the struggle to manage that dilemma in very dramatic ways in recent years. And I was wondering if Ambassador Green could offer us some thoughts about what is the tightrope walk here, and what is the solution that does justice to both the preservation of our advantage, while at the same time maintaining a minimal set of links with China, which, again, are things that we simply cannot eliminate.
Let me come to that question, but can I first address a couple of the other issues that you've been surfacing here, and if I may, just a tiny bit of balance. So you talked about fragmentation going on in the West, and the example was given of the IRA, and our friend has indicated how that's not necessarily such a great example. But I would have said that the IRA is, in fact, counter to most of the global trends in the West that I see. I lived the last 3 years in Germany. I lived through the start of the Ukraine war and the response of Europe and America to that. And I can tell you for sure that has driven Europe much, much closer to America. That has revived NATO. And more than that, in Germany, it sparked a level of anxiety about authoritarianism, which changed their policies towards China, right? So at the level of NATO, at the level of the North Atlantic theatre, I in fact see the West coming together. And surely I only have to say Five Eyes, Quad, and AUKUS to give you a sense that in other ways, the West is driving fast together. And then Joanna says, and she's right, that we need to move faster to make sure that those countries in our near abroad feel that we are bringing them public goods. But let me tell you this, we, Australia, we live in the Southwest Pacific. We outspend in development assistance 4-1 the next most generous country towards South Pacific countries. You'll probably be able to guess what the next country is. And guess what we led that with? We led that with a program of undersea telecommunications cables. So, precisely the sorts of technologies that we want to get into. So I think we're onto it. Joanna's right to identify that we need to do more. There will always be more to do. But I think we're moving at a satisfactory pace. On China, you will have seen that we have been engaged for the last 18 months in an activity of stabilizing our bilateral relationship with China. And if you think about that verb stabilizing and you provide its opposite, I don't think there's no country in the world that wants an unstable relationship with China. So that we need. What essentially has changed? The two things essentially that have changed is that the level of rhetoric that the previous government was engaged in relation to China has been toned down, and current government has prioritised engagement with China. Policy settings remain the same, and the degree to which we are gripped up with our Quad and other partners remains exactly the same. Yes, we've been through a difficult period with China in relation to trade, and that still goes on. There are still constraints in our trade that we want to have fixed. But here again, I'm a bit worried that there's a sort of chicken little syndrome going on here. We're talking it as though the whole world of global trade is going to be bifurcated or trifurcated because of strategic concerns. And I'm sure you're right that this yard is going to get wider, and maybe the fences are going to get higher. But what were the key issues in the trading problems that we had with China? Red wine. I don't think that's a big strategic concern. Lobsters and seafood, not a big deal. Timber products. So I still see a wide range of fields in which a country like mine can have a profitable relationship with China, even as we deal with some difficulties with our large partner.
Thank you. Thank you for that intervention, because my prejudice has always been that it will take a lot to destroy the foundations of international trade, which are so deep and so wide, and which tie us to our competitors in a way that historically, has never been the case. But I want to come to Vijay, because India in some ways is a very unique case, where it has been at the receiving end of Chinese assertiveness in very blatant ways. And India, in a very self-conscious way, is looking to widen the space in terms of its own dependencies on China. So where do you see the evolution of this policy, depending on how Sino-Indian relations go over the next year or the next 2 years?
I think with the background of Cold War and the non-aligned movement of Indian legacy of foreign policy, in last 10 years at least, we have gone far ahead, and we are engaging with different countries on a different dimensions. And for example, in energy security, we have been very good with the Gulf countries and as well as far off South American countries. On climate change, we have so many partners. So India is now leveraging its competence and as well as per its need to deal with and engage with different countries. Not everyone is on the same level, but as far as the need of both the countries are managed or they are nurtured, India is willing to do kind of, in certain cases, even limited interaction with them. With some other countries, like especially those in the West and US especially, even Dr. Jaishankar has made it very clear that yes, they are our natural partners in many technology-related things, as well as on several strategic issues. And India will continue to do this. Now India has an advantage, and pardon me for making a political statement, that India is going to be only one major country where there is going to be economic, political stability for next 5 years. And that is not, there is not even 1% doubt about it, at least those who watch India. But the situation in the West is not same. In fact, majority of we don't know what will happen after 12 months, 14 months in as far as the internal politics is concerned. The India has another very tightrope walk as far as the neighborhood is concerned, because their dynamics change very rapidly, uh, solely based on the internal politics, and also the dynamics between India and China, how much they can exert their influence. So this is another challenge for India. On a larger scale, larger picture of technology, I feel that if we take three parameters, like access of technology, affordability, and the security, which includes also privacy related issues and this deep fake, etc. Uh, the division is, as Raja has said, that between US and China does play a big role, but also the divisions between North and South also will play a big role, especially as far as, and we saw it as far as the climate related technologies are concerned, as even the vaccine technologies are concerned during pandemic. The access and affordability of the vaccine, which was a kind of a life-saving need, there was quite a disparity between various countries. And in that, India could survive because it could develop its own technology. Otherwise, we would not have been able to afford Pfizer vaccine for that matter. So I think India is in a very pivotal state. They are doing some tightrope walk for sure, but India's strategic interests are being preserved to a large extent. That is what I would say.
Thank you. There's a point that Ambassador Green made, which I think is worth reminding ourselves of, and it's a profoundly anti-Marxist point, that politics overwhelms economics at critical moments in history. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine sort of gives the lie to the idea that everything is driven by sort of impersonal economic forces and so on and so forth. But that takes me to a question that I want to ask Dan, which is, what about the risks of fragmentation in our domestic politics and the implications that has for our international political role and the consequences of those implications for the kind of stability that we've taken for granted in some sense for the last 70 odd years? How should countries outside the United States look at the United States in the immediate future when we think about these risks of fragmentation going forward?
The easy questions. First of all, I mean, I think, let me start with it may be that the political future of who's going to be running the executive branch in the United States is much more in question than the political question of who's going to be running the government in India. That doesn't mean that actually there's more or less stability in one or the other. India has, there's enormous disruption happening in India's political economy right now because of the pace of economic growth. Every 3 years, there's a whole new economy. I mean, and that obviously does, not to be Marxist with you, Ashley, ever, but that does have a bearing on the politics of the country, and whether that's below the surface of a dominant single party or between parties, it's going to cause political change, not necessarily in who's running the government, but political change will be happening underneath the surface. In the United States, it's ripped right open right now, and so you see it between the two major parties. And there's no question that when I go around the world right now, particularly in Europe, the single event of most geopolitical consequence that people see is the 2024 election in the United States. Because I think in 2016, people were forced to confront the reality that the United States remains the long pole in the tent in most structures of global governance that are indispensable to a global order. And I think that remains true. I think these challenges that we're talking about are not disconnected or in the same way that technology is baked into geopolitics. the relative decline of American power with the rise of other countries, which is not just China, but also other countries, is deeply connected to the kind of internal divisions that we are seeing in the United States today. And one of the challenges that I think one of the challenges that is a solvable challenge that the United States confronts is whether or not we can figure out a way to unite enough to serve as the kind of what I call cooperator in chief that the world needs the United States to be, which is a very different model of American leadership than what we saw in the aftermath of the Cold War. I'm not talking about, there is no back to normal, there's only forward to normal. I'm not talking about trying to recover something that existed. But I think if we are to go forward to normal, that involves the United States figuring out some way to get through the current internal divisions, which are, in my mind, a combination of leadership, economic progress, and a recognition that the United States doesn't have to have the kind of hegemonic power that we had 20 years ago in order to still be a productive, constructive force and a long pole in the tent for global governance in the years to come.
We'll need to have a long conversation on that last sentence. But James, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I mean, it was to build on that. So I went back recently and reread parts of Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which is quite interesting when thinking about the role that the US could play in the international system. So you have a pessimistic view, which is that either the US will, the classic model that your international obligations exceed your ability to sustain them. So either you see a future for the US of gradual imperial decline, or potentially under a different administration, the voluntary dismembering of some of these alliance structures. But even on the more optimistic sort of note that sort of many of us would hope would happen, in which the US kind of conceives of its power in a different way as the sort of the lead part of a broader team, it's very difficult to take the kind of steps that you need to take to construct a new balance of power in Asia with respect to China and globally. So IRA is one example, AUKUS is another, which was a generally successful but extremely disruptive step within the Western alliance with respect to France in particular. And I think, what may happen in the upcoming election will be one of the ultimate tests of this. I mean, if you're a European nation, if you're Japan, if you're the Republic of Korea, you're extremely worried about what this might mean for the US's posture with respect to its most important alliances. And so the fact that in order to balance China, you need to take these bold steps, AUKUS-like measures repeatedly over time, and it's often difficult to take these steps while keeping the entirety of this quite broad multi-party coalition together. I mean, it's not an impossible task. I'm just saying it's quite a tricky one.
I mean, I would hazard or wager the argument that we've done quite well on that count, right? There was a perturbation initially after the announcement of AUKUS, but in a sense, the international political market has absorbed that cost. And today it has simply become one of the architectural features of what we need to do going forward vis-a-vis China. Is that a accurate summation?
Well, I think that's true, but I think it ignores the substance of AUKUS, which is as important as the participants. So, first of all, to James, I would say the Australian alliance with the United States is long and deep. It's a founding part of our foreign and security policy. We've fought alongside the United States in every war for 100 years. This partnership is not going to go away quickly, and we're very confident about its future under any administration. Second thing to say is, you can talk about who's in AUKUS, but what's AUKUS doing? I mean, I assumed, Ashley, that at some point this evening you'd want to get onto the degree to which our defence procurement systems are gripped up for a more tech-relevant moment in global struggle, including warfare, and that is precisely where AUKUS is driving us. Don't forget, AUKUS has got two pillars. First pillar is about submarines, and that's reasonably tech-heavy. The second element is all about developing AI, quantum, undersea, autonomous together in a way that strengthens each of the three partners. And just this last weekend, AUKUS defence ministers were there announcing new ways in which they're going to use AI to detect submarine activity. There are new ways in which they're going to cooperate in space. So I thought at some point tonight you would want to get onto, are we driving our systems hard enough to put tech at the centre of our defences? And I was going to say that's a key thing that AUKUS does.
Let me follow up on that with you, Joanna. So we are creating these, for want of a better word, mini-laterals, where there is a unity of vision and a unity of effort. Two questions. Will this effort represented by AUKUS and what we are trying to do with India, say an ISET, survive the possibilities of political perturbations in a country like the United States? Is there enough demand momentum on the part of other players to sustain this, irrespective of what happens in Washington? And two, from your perspective, what have we done well so far, and what is it that we still need to do to be able to create some sort of a minimum success vis-a-vis this threat of fragmentation?
So I have to echo Ambassador Green's comment that I think the relationship between in the US will continue to have a very strong influence in our region. But I do think the more fragmented the internal US politics becomes, the more it will motivate organizations and minilaterals like AUKUS or Quad, because they're actually providing a balance to that domestic fragmentation. That's actually why they exist and how the motivation for their establishment. I think to go back to earlier comments around multilateralism and the death of multilateralism, I actually disagree with that point. I think we are not seeing progress in multilateral forums, but we are successfully seeing countries like Australia and the US working together, Australia and India in particular, working together to maintain the status quo in a way that Australia and the US can't. If Australia and the US engage at the UN General Assembly on issues, it comes with a whole bunch of baggage and assumptions. Whereas if Australia and India are participating and collaborating, it changes the conversation entirely, as it does when we're engaging in the context of the Quad, for example. So I think we shouldn't dismiss, although it's not progress, we shouldn't dismiss the value and the effort that is being put into maintaining the status quo and the rules-based order within those multilateral forums. And we should, of course, be doubling down in the minilateral environment. Also, just to pick up on the point that Ambassador Green made about that countries in our region are already doing a lot. My point is not so much that countries need to do more. My point is that we need to get better at our strategic messaging as to why we're doing it. This point about why we're engaging in AUKUS, the purpose of doing AUKUS, is not a point that is well appreciated. The technology dimensions of that is not well appreciated. And China is really good at explaining its messaging and its motivations. And I fear, in the context of technology, particularly around these advanced emerging technologies, that we're repeating the same mistakes that we made with 5G, and we're ceding the space to China because we're not engaging in the hearts and minds conversation about why it matters to have technology with good governance built in, as opposed to why it's better to have the cheapest technology fastest.
Yeah.
I don't want to defend Trump, but let me say, look, every one of the major issues we praise Biden for were all initiated by Trump. The Indo-Pacific construct, the Quad, the questioning of the China consensus in Washington, the creation of resilient supply chains during the pandemic, the investment in vaccine production, the fast tracking of vaccine production. So I think there is a certain persona which everyone reacts, and I know the Europeans are in particular very, very upset. As far as India is concerned, of course, we had good relations with Trump. That's not the point I'm making. What I'm saying is that there is a system. Trump might be, crazy, but we've seen the system is stronger than individuals in the US. There is, I believe at least, there is a deep state in the US that can withstand a crazy individual who thinks he can dismantle it. And he didn't really dismantle anything.
Can it survive twice, though?
I think if you do it once, if you've done it once, it's much easier the second time. So I would say the US president has a lot of power. He also doesn't have too much power. There are too many constraints built in. The second point, I think, to be a bit of a Marxist, I think this is where the technology point comes in. That what is technology? It is the change in the nature of forces of production. If the forces of production fundamentally change, it produces inevitably a change in the superstructure. So whether you want it or not today, you're not going to be able to sustain the post-1991 global trading order. So therefore, the hope that, look, well, actually you'll like that order, that the changes in the nature of production and the nature of the competition are not going to allow it to be sustained. So it has to be rearranged. So I think by framing it as fragmentation, we do injustice to what's happening. If you think of it as a rearrangement, then I think we get a better picture. And mind you, in the evolution of globalization, there were two phases. Between 45 to 1991, 2000, states retained considerable sovereignty. States had considerable freedom to restrain markets, especially given the devastation of the Second World War. The states had significant room, but the WTO thought you could transcend that. You could transcend sovereignty, and that the markets and the global forces will take care of all the social issues. That is what is shattered. And I think we are going back to a pre-1991 form of economic order in which Soviet Union was not part of the rest of the economic system. So I don't think we should mourn the passing of the post-1991 order because its internal contradictions, again to use a Marxist phrase, have come to the fore. And I think we are into a new arrangement. The question is, can we do that nicely, smartly? That is the question, and not whether there will be a new order, because the structure is changing because the forces of production have changed.
Well, I'm going to break a habit of a lifetime and sort of disagree with Raja. From our perspective, hanging on to as much of the pre-existing global order as we possibly can is very important. Yes, the WTO is weakened, but is the world better off with a weakened WTO or no WTO? Yes, important principles like freedom of navigation are being challenged, but that's more of a reason to defend them as we are. So I don't think I'm quite as fatalistic as Raja. I guess I'm a practitioner, and in this field, I'm in the business of hanging on to as much of the pre-existing order as we can, even as, I'm sure he's right, we are building a new one.
Hallelujah. I'm a conservative. I like that last line.
Can I just make a very brief comment in response as well? I think if we reflect on how the WTO came to be, right, it was essentially a club of like-minded nations who agreed a set of rules that then, if you agreed to those set of globalization rules and agreed to abide by those trade rules, then you could join the club. And in essence, that is what much of the conversation around the like-minded technology groupings is looking to replicate. So I do think that part of what we're doing is actually repeating history. And the question is, can we repeat it and learn from history?
Just one sentence. Look, WTO is a universalist organization. Like-minded coalitions are not. But design, though how much we say inclusive, we're going to exclude some countries because the problem with the countries that have misused the WTO framework is what you're trying to address today. So I think the WTO was a multilateral institution of a universal character. And the fact that today half the Americans regret having got China into it, and that China has weaponized that system to its unilateral advantage. And now that's why you're changing the rules.
I'm going to end this part of the panel because I do want to go to the floor. I want to ask Vijay Chautawale, though, one last question. As you see this ferment in the system, And we are still in the process of it shaking out, and we don't quite have a sense of what the final contours will look like. Where do you see India positioning itself? And how does India take advantage of the disequilibria, as it were, to maximize its own advantage?
It's a, I'm not an astrologer, but I would say a couple of things. First of all, India's collaboration model is always uh, not exploitative, unlike China. So, in that respect, India is likely to provide a leadership to the disadvantaged part of the world, where there will be a win-win situation to the extent possible. Second is that India will continue to have to strengthen the strategic partnership with US. There is no question about it. And third is that this new partnership which India is trying to build with Middle East countries, Gulf countries, especially with countries like UAE, and we are seeing multiple dimensions of that every time there is a bilateral engagement. That will prosper. On Quad side, of course, India will remain committed to Quad and get more and more engaged with the Quad countries on the strategic issues. And India will continue to have some transactional relationship with Russia. I guess that's all I would like to say.
Okay.
Raja might add something.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to call this part of the session to adjournment. I want to take a few questions. I don't know how much time we have. We probably have about 10 minutes. So if you want to address a question, raise your hand. I'll call upon you. Identify yourself quickly. And if you can be very brief in asking the question, that would help me get as many people into the thing. Yes, sir.
Hello, sir. My name is Akash. I am from Central University of Gujarat, School of National Security Studies. My question is a theoretical one. Is polarity as a concept in global politics outdated right now? Or are we living in a world where there is a no pole? Since every country is doing what they are trying to achieve in their national interest. So is polarity a relevant concept today?
I'm a failed academic. I will assign that question to Dan as briefly as you can, Dan.
Sure. No, I don't think it's an outdated concept. I think it'll continue to be used because there will continue to be countries that successfully put forward a vision of global order that attracts others to them. The Russians 10 years ago started using multipolar order before it was maybe true. And when I was the US ambassador, I always used to say to my Russian counterpart, I'll grant you that there's a multipolar order, but what makes you think that Russia is a pole? Because poles attract things to them rather than repel them. And I think the US it's not a unipolar moment, and it's not even quite a bipolar moment anymore right now. But there are still countries that are putting forward an idea for global politics that is attractive, and that is conventionally what polls do.
I'm going to take two questions at a time just in the interests of moving forward.
I'm K.K. Roy Chaudhary. I'm an energy scholar in Delhi. My question to, all the eminent elite panelists, what reflections you are perceiving what reflections on the future of geopolitics you are perceiving from the fact that the COP28 opened with a very encouraging message of operationalization of the loss and damage fund, but with abysmally low contribution from the developed countries, in particular US and Japan. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I, Akram Raza.
Hold it up. Hold it up.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Akram Mirza, and I'm teaching as assistant professor at University of Delhi in Department of Political Science. So, my question is, as we see, India is nowadays is very engaging in the international relations or even in the geopolitics. So, how do you see uh, India stand within the BRICS or in a SCO, where India is engaging closely with China, but on the other hand, India is also the member of Quad, where it opposes the China's geopolitical. So, how do you see all of these things? India stand.
That goes to Vijay. Explain your country's multi-alignment to this very confused audience. Go ahead, Vijay. Okay. The two of you.
I think it's not a question of how many clubs you sit in. The question is, what are you doing in those clubs? You can sit in SCO and BRICS, but not endorse the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the differences between India and China are so large today. They have material difference in terms of what India does in the BRICS. In the Quad, on the other hand, the convergence of India-US interests, India's interests with Australia and Japan, today see Quad does a lot more things which are more directly relevant to India than what the BRICS does. That doesn't mean you're going to simply abandon your other friends in the BRICS, like Russia and a whole lot of other countries that are going to come in. So I think don't go by that you sit in different clubs. I don't think that necessarily makes it multi-alignment. The question is, what are each of these organizations doing to further India's interests? That's what matters. But India is capable of holding two different things in its head, which is what it is doing at this point.
I'll take two more, please, quickly. Yes, the young lady.
So thank you, eminent panelist. So can I just counter question maybe to Dan sir, because he said that pole attract. So I'm working on soft power for my PhD thesis, and this attraction is a major component of soft power as postulated by the major proponent of it. So my question is, when we say that poles are those who attract, where are we locating the hard power part of it? Because we said that Cold War was a bipolar world because Russia, if not on the soft power front, was competing USA on the hard power front. So yeah.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman there, please. Oh, the lady, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hello. Good evening to all the panelists. I'm Anushka Saxena. I attempt to study China at a think tank based out of Bengaluru called Takshashila Institution. My question is to Professor Weaver. Professor, you made a comment about the divide between the global north and the global south vis-a-vis approaches to AI, and how the north's approach is largely risk and security based, while the south's approach is that pertaining to opportunity. And so, if I'm paraphrasing you or right about correctly. And so I'd like to know from you and from any other panelists who would have thoughts on this, what exactly is the cultural underpinning of this kind of a divide? Because it's also counterintuitive based on the economic or innovation-based ideas we attach to what the global north and the global south do. And so what are the cultural or the political underpinnings you believe are behind this kind of a divide? Thank you.
Ambassador Green, would you take the question of the relationship between hard and soft power?
No, but I want to. I want to add something to the question about India, and I couldn't agree more with what Raja said about India's involvement in the Quad and how significant it is for us. And I don't know much about India's involvement in the SCO or the BRICS, but I will say this. India has a very important personality in the Quad as a leader of the global south. And the fact that it's in that club makes it more important to a partner like Australia. And I've even heard Indians say that the fact that it's a member of the Quad makes it more influential when it speaks to countries of the global south. So I think we've got to get past this question of mutually exclusive clubs. Sometimes the clubs overlap, and that can be very powerful.
Yeah, I'm going to try to real quick. First of all, I agree with you. We can't leave hard power out. And then arguably part of what the United States and some of our partners did in the 90s was assume that we had entered an age when soft power alone was enough. So hard power and soft power are intimately related, because in the same way, you can't actually sustain hard power over the long term without soft power, because soft power is more than soft. It's also the economic engine that allows you to attract people and also support your hard power. So the two are intimately related. I think the challenge right now is that for the first time in recent history, you have a major world power that is going to have to figure out a way not to sustain its polarity on its own, but instead to set up this constellation of cooperative kind of arrangements and have that be, in a way, the new pole, the new thing that attracts people, other countries into it. And I think it's too soon to tell whether we'll succeed, but there's lots of reason for optimism, because there are a lot of these cooperative ventures like the Quad that are giving a case that hard and soft power can be combined to be something attractive to people.
Joanna?
Okay, I'm going to make 3 points really quickly. One, to Raj's point about the Chinese weaponizing the existing rules, and now we're looking to rewrite the rules. I would say, from my perspective, it's not that China is weaponizing the rules, it's China is breaking the rules, and we're not trying to rewrite them, we're trying to defend them. And I think that's a really important distinction. I couldn't agree more in terms of the fact that we're in different clubs, Australia and India. That actually adds to our value. Being in those different clubs but being able to have frank conversation is our value add. And on the question about artificial intelligence and the driver, I don't think the difference between the global north and the global south is cultural. I actually think it's economic and from a development perspective. The global south isn't interested in having a conversation about existential risks when it's looking at how to feed its populations. And so the focus is very different, and it's driven by the economic and development contexts.
James, you get the last word.
Oh, I just wanted really to echo a little bit of what Dan said on this hard power, soft power thing. I mean, heretical though it is to say, I think the whole conception of soft power, I'm sure your PhD will be wonderful, is just slightly less important now than it was 10, 15 years ago. And that hard power is essential to the sustaining of these relationships. You know, why is it that the United States has large military bases in Japan and Korea? Because these are signals of commitment. Why is it that sharing advanced technology matters so much? You know, hard power is the most important part often in the development of these new relationships. And so I don't think you should be sort of ashamed about that. I mean, this is the lesson of the war in Ukraine, is that hard power really matters in the maintenance of deterrence or the coping with its failure. And you know, we should be clear-eyed about that.
And that's precisely why institutions like AUKUS are so important, right? Because for all the issues of democratic solidarity at the core, there are questions of technology, questions of military capability, and so on and so forth. Well, on that note, we will call this evening to an end. Thank you all for your rapt attention. Join me in giving our colleagues a hand, and have a wonderful evening.